One of the most important considerations in video creation is getting your shutter speed right. In this video, we're going to look at what shutter speed is, how it applies to video, and stick around to the end where I'm going to give you some tips on how to pick the right shutter speed no matter what kind of conditions you're filming in. Before we get started, we really need to understand what shutter speed is and how it's measured. When you think of shutter speed, you probably think of photography cameras that make that click sound when the shutter opens and closes. But all modern digital cameras, when taking video, use an electronic shutter instead of a mechanical shutter. This means that instead of a shutter that covers the sensor and then opens back up and then closes again to give you an actual frame of your image, the camera electronically reads the light data that's hitting the sensor for whatever amount of time your shutter speed is set to. For the purposes of this video, we're going to think of it like a mechanical shutter that opens and closes just to simplify the concepts. But as far as shutter speed is concerned, they work basically the same way. Now, not all cameras show the shutter speed in fractional measurements. It might just show a single number like 50 or 100. So now that we know how shutter speed works and how it's measured, we can look at how it actually applies to video. The first thing that shutter speed affects is motion blur. Now, motion blur occurs when an object moves within the frame over the time period that the shutter is open. So for example, if your shutter speed is 1/50th of a second and an object is moving at a speed that can cover 2 feet within that 1/50th of a second, that's how much motion blur you'll have, 2 feet of motion blur. And so what this means is the longer your shutter speed is, the longer time that the shutter is open, the more motion blur that you'll get. And the shorter time, the faster your shutter speed is, the less motion blur that you'll get. Now, of course, if an object is stationary or is moving very, very slowly, there's not a whole lot of motion blur that can really occur in that situation regardless of what your shutter speed is. And vice versa, if you have an object that's moving very quickly, such as a race car or even someone running, even higher shutter speeds, you'll still have some motion blur in those situations. The second thing that shutter speed affects is your exposure. The way modern digital cameras work is by reading the amount of light that hits each individual pixel on the camera's sensor. The more light that each pixel receives, the brighter that part of the image or that pixel will appear in the final image. Now that can happen in two different ways, intensity and time. So if you have a very bright, intense light, that's going to appear very bright and intense in your final image. Now, if you're shooting in bright sunlight, you can reduce the intensity of that sunlight by having a faster shutter speed, by exposing the sensor to that light for a shorter period of time. Now, on the other hand, if you're shooting at night or in a dimly lit room, you can increase the exposure by having a longer shutter speed and exposing the sensor for a longer period of time. And the third way that shutter speed affects your video is through flicker, or sometimes referred to as banding, where you have bands of dark and bands of light kind of moving through your image, either up or down. Now, flicker appears when the frequency of the light hitting the sensor is mismatched with the shutter speed on the camera. As the camera is scanning the pixels on the sensor, if there's a mismatch, part of the sensor will capture when the light is on, and part of the sensor will capture when the light is off. And this is where we get those lines, those bands, or the flicker. Now, traditionally, incandescent lights operate directly off the voltage source, and so that's typically known. In the United States, it's around 60 hertz, and in most of the rest of the world, it's around 50 hertz. Usually, you can get away with setting your camera to a shutter speed of 1/60 or 1/50, and a lot of times that'll clear things up for you. But any light source that uses a ballast, a voltage converter, anything like that, the frequency can vary quite a bit. And this is where we need to start to adjust our shutter speed to be able to compensate for that flicker. Now, some modern cameras actually have a flicker reduction feature, which allows you to more finely tune your shutter speed to really be able to eliminate that flicker that might be appearing in your image. Now, if you've stuck around to this point, I want to go over some tips and how I actually go about setting my shutter speed when I'm shooting video, regardless of the situation that I'm in. I use shutter angle plus exposure plus flicker, which gives me my final shutter speed that I'm going to use regardless of the situation. Now, the first part of that equation is shutter angle. Now, I'm not going to go too deeply into what shutter angle is, but the general rule of thumb is to use what's called the 180-degree rule, which essentially means that whatever your frame rate is that you're using in the video, you want to double that, and that's what your shutter speed is going to be. So for example, if you're filming in 24 frames per second, we double that to 48, and your shutter speed should be 1/48th of a second. Now, a lot of cameras don't have that option, so you want to just get as close to that as you can. Generally, that's going to be 1/50th of a second is going to be your shutter speed. And if you're filming in something such as 60 frames per second, we double that to 120, and our shutter speed is going to be 1/20th of a second. The shutter angle rule of thumb really simplifies your decision-making process when it comes to choosing a shutter speed. You just need to know what frames per second that you want to shoot in, what your frame rate is going to be, and then double that, and that becomes your shutter speed. Now, the second part of the equation is exposure. And this is one of the few times that I would say go ahead and modify your shutter speed, is if you've exhausted all other options to get your exposure where you need it, you can utilize shutter speed to get your exposure just right. Now, of course, we need to look at some of the other options for adjusting our exposure before we start messing with our shutter speed. All digital cameras have what's called ISO, which adjusts the camera sensor's sensitivity to light. And so you can move that up or down to adjust your exposure. The problem with this is some cameras don't have a lot of tolerance for adjusting your ISO without starting to introduce noise into your image. So you've just got to kind of know your camera. Famous cameras such as the Sony a7S III and the FX3 have incredible ISO performance, whereas some other cameras, not so much. APS-C or crop sensor cameras tend to struggle a little bit with adjusting the ISO too much. But that is your first tool that you can start to look at. Now, if we're in a very bright environment, we can look at something like an ND filter, which is essentially sunglasses for your camera, which will reduce the amount of light that's actually coming into the camera, reducing your need to adjust ISO or shutter speed. And of course, if we're in a dark situation, a dark room or nighttime, the best option is to add some light with some video lights or however else we can get some light into that situation. But the reality is sometimes we're in run and gun situations, or we just don't have the right equipment that we need to get the exposure we want, and that's where shutter speed comes into play. So once we've exhausted all of those other options, we can squeeze a little bit more performance and a little bit better exposure in our image by adjusting our shutter speed up or down, by lengthening or shortening the amount of time that the sensor is actually exposed to the light. Now, I find that you can deviate from the 180-degree rule by about 50% before you start to get either excessive stutter or excessive motion blur in your image. But you've got to just try it out for yourself and see what works best for you. And the last part of the equation is flicker. And there are software tools that you can use in your video editing software to try to remove some of the flicker. They don't always work great and they can create some artifacts. And so this is actually a very important one to get right in camera. Now, if your camera has a flicker reduction feature, you can utilize that to eliminate the flicker without deviating too far from your ideal shutter speed. Now, if your camera doesn't have a flicker reduction feature, this is where experimentation kind of comes into play. There's no formula, there's no set numbers that you can really use. It's just a matter of raising your shutter speed and lowering your shutter speed until you find the right shutter speed that is close enough to your ideal shutter speed, but still reduces or eliminates that flickering and that banding. Now, of course, the best option is to go ahead and turn that light off that's causing the flickering in the first place, but that's not always going to be an option. Maybe that light is your only light source, or maybe that light is creating a certain ambiance in the room, a certain look, and you're not able to turn it off. And so there's a little bit of trial and error and a little bit of experimentation that needs to be done to get that banding to go away. So let's go ahead and run through an example of actually utilizing this formula to dial in our shutter speed regardless of the situation that we're filming in. Okay, we've got a basic image here. We're filming in 24 frames per second, so our shutter speed is set to 1/48, and we can see our multimeter is showing that we're a little bit overexposed, and you can certainly see that banding in the image. So we're going to go ahead and work through our workflow here. So first thing we're going to do is get our exposure set properly, and we're raising that up right now to lower the exposure until our multimeter shows that we're at plus or minus 0. And now we're going to go ahead and work on our flicker to go ahead and get that to go away. And there we go. Flicker is gone, exposure still looks good, and we are all set with our image. So go ahead and hit those like and subscribe buttons and let me know down in the comments if there's any topics you'd like me to cover in future videos, and I'll see you in the next one.